21,000 hectares. That is the scale of the agricultural vision taking shape around Samendéni in Burkina Faso. But the most important number may not be the hectares. It may be the number of harvests Burkina Faso can produce from the same land. For generations, a farmer here has lived by a rule no government could negotiate with. When the rain comes, you plant. When it stops, the clock starts running out. Now, Ibrahim Traoré's government is trying to change that equation. Irrigation systems are expanding. Hundreds of hectares are being brought under controlled water, and some new agricultural zones are being designed to produce not once, but potentially 2 or even 3 times a year. Think about what that means. Rice when the rains arrive, wheat when the dry season begins, vegetables in another production window. The land has not become larger. The year has, but 21,000 hectares is still a vision, not 21,000 completed irrigated hectares. And that creates the real question. Can Traore turn control of water into control of Burkina Faso's food future? Because water creates options, and options create sovereignty. For a farmer in Burkina Faso, rain is not weather. It is a deadline. The first clouds gather, the soil softens, seed goes into the ground, and suddenly an entire season begins racing against time. If the rains arrive late, planting is delayed. If they stop too early, yields fall. If they fail completely, there is very little a farmer can negotiate with. That is the old rule. You work when the sky allows it. And when the sky closes the window, the land begins waiting again. This matters because dependence on rainfall is not only an agricultural problem, it becomes an economic problem. A shorter growing season can mean less food. Less food can mean higher prices. Higher prices can mean more pressure to import. And every imported ton becomes another reminder that food security is connected to something Burkina Faso does not fully control: the rain. Traoré's irrigation strategy begins with a simple idea. If the country cannot control the weather, it can at least control more of the water. Dams, canals, reservoirs, pumps, drainage, irrigated fields. None of these sound as dramatic as a political speech, but they can change the calendar. A farmer with reliable water does not have to see the dry season only as an ending. It can become another production window. That changes the meaning of the same hectare. One field may support rice during the rains, then wheat in the dry season, then vegetables in another cycle. The land does not multiply. Its useful time does. And that is why irrigation is much bigger than an infrastructure story. It is a sovereignty story. But there is an important distinction. Water infrastructure does not automatically create food security. The canals have to work. The pumps have to run. Farmers need seed. Inputs must arrive on time. Harvests must be stored and sold. Irrigation only opens the door. The rest of the system still has to walk through it. And in one 180-hectare site, Burkina Faso began testing exactly what that new calendar could look like. The first real break in that old calendar appears at Traore, 180 hectares. Not enough land to transform Burkina Faso by itself, but enough to test a different way of farming. During the rainy season, the fields can produce rice. When the rains disappear, the same land does not simply go quiet. It switches. Wheat enters the dry season. Then vegetables can occupy another production window. That changes the economics of the field, because the real value of irrigation is not only that it can protect production from rainfall uncertainty, it allows the same hectare to work for more of the year. At Traore, official projections point to roughly 600 tons of rice during the wet season and around 400 tons of wheat during the dry season. Tomatoes and onions are also part of the annual production plan. If those targets are reached, the site would not just produce more food, it would create more activity around the same land. More planting, more harvesting, more transport, more storage, more work for farmers, more chances to sell into local markets. That is why the most important change is not the size of the field, it is the calendar. 180 hectares can still produce only so much. But if the land is active across multiple seasons, its economic role becomes larger. And this is where Burkina Faso's self-reliance story becomes more concrete. A country does not reduce food dependence only by opening new farmland. It can also reduce dependence by getting more production from land it already has. But projections are not outcomes. 600 tons of rice and 400 tons of wheat only matter if the water keeps flowing, the crops reach harvest, the grain is stored, and farmers can sell what they produce. Because irrigation can create a second season. Only a working system can turn that second season into food. Segure shows what changing the calendar could look like. The next challenge is scale. In Lariba, more than 1,000 hectares of irrigated perimeters were put into water in June 2026. That number matters. But what matters even more is what had to appear around the fields. At Duna, 600 hectares were developed with storage warehouses, rural roads, drainage systems, drying areas, and other infrastructure designed to support production. This is where irrigation stops being only a farming project and starts becoming an economic system. Water can make the crop possible, but water cannot move the rice. It cannot dry the grain. It cannot protect wheat from spoilage. It cannot carry vegetables to market. Every new hectare creates another demand on the chain. More transport, more storage, more machinery, more buyers, more maintenance, more people who know how to keep everything working. That is why scaling is so difficult. 180 hectares can be watched closely. 1,000 hectares cannot depend on improvisation. The larger the system becomes, the more one weak link can damage everything behind it. A broken pump can stop planting. A blocked canal can reduce yields. A full warehouse can turn a good harvest into a price collapse. A bad road can trap produce before it reaches the market. But if those links hold something important, changes. The farmer is no longer producing only when the rainy season gives permission. The system begins creating its own production windows. That is the real scale-up. Not only more land underwater, more time under production. And once a country begins creating additional farming seasons, irrigation starts affecting more than agriculture. It begins affecting food supply, farmer income, processing, employment, and national resilience. Then came another number. 605 hectares, nearly 9.88 billion CFA francs. That is the scale of the Niagema Tukaro irrigation project. The engineering behind that number shows how much infrastructure sits beneath one irrigation headline. The site includes a pumping station rated at 1,560 liters per second, 4 pumps rated at 520 liters per second each, with 3 designed to operate simultaneously, and 2 600 kVA backup generators. It also includes more than 45 kilometers of irrigation canals, over 26 kilometers of drainage network, more than 36 kilometers of agricultural service roads, a mobile drainage station with 8 motor pumps, and a 250-ton storage warehouse. Those details matter because they reveal the real unit of agricultural sovereignty. It is not the hectare by itself. It is the network that keeps the hectare productive. Water has to arrive at the right time. Excess water has to leave. Equipment needs backup. Crops need a route out of the field and somewhere to wait before sale. That is why a 605-hectare project can require billions of CFA francs before a single additional harvest proves whether the investment works. And this is where the story becomes more than water. The government says the project was funded entirely with national resources. That matters symbolically. A country talking about food sovereignty is putting its own public money into infrastructure intended to produce more food. But domestic financing is not the same thing as success. Spending nearly 10 billion CFA can build canals, install pumps, prepare fields, and create the physical system. It cannot guarantee that the system will still be working 10 years later. That is where the real test begins. Who maintains the pumps? Who clears the canals? Who pays for repairs? Who manages water when demand rises? What happens when a critical part fails in the middle of a planting window? Irrigation infrastructure has 2 lives. The first is the day it is inaugurated. The second is every ordinary day after the cameras leave. That second life matters more. If the system is maintained well, 605 hectares can become a platform for repeated production. If maintenance fails, a blocked canal here, a broken pump there, a drainage problem, or a shortage of spare parts can slowly reduce what a large investment delivers. This is why self-reliance is not just about paying for a project yourself. It is about being able to operate it, maintain it, repair it, and finance the next repair when something breaks. And even 605 hectares still looks small beside the number hanging over the larger vision. 21,000 hectares. Now the scale of the story changes. Samendéni is not being presented simply as another irrigation site. The long-term objective is to develop 21,000 hectares of irrigable land in the Mohune Valley through the Samendéni program. But the number has to be understood correctly. Burkina Faso has not completed 21,000 irrigated hectares. Official Agriculture Ministry reporting says the first lot is 1,500 hectares, and in June it described 1,500 hectares as already developed. Segure's 180 hectares are part of that broader effort, while Niegama Tukoro adds another 605 hectares. 21,000 hectares is the destination, not the current finish line. And that distinction makes the story more interesting, not less, because going from hundreds of hectares toward tens of thousands is not simply a construction problem. Every additional hectare needs water, but it also needs farmer seed, machinery, drainage, storage roads, processing markets, and maintenance. Scale the land without scaling those systems, and the headline grows faster than the agriculture. That is the danger. Imagine 21,000 hectares of irrigable land on a map. Now imagine pumps failing during planting canals, losing capacity, warehouses filling faster than crops can be sold, or farmers producing more than processors and markets can absorb. Suddenly, the size of the land is no longer the most important number. The strength of the system is, but imagine the opposite future. Water reaches the fields reliably. Farmers use the same land across multiple production windows. Storage expands with production. Processing grows beside agriculture. More food reaches domestic markets. Then, 21,000 hectares begins to mean something much larger. Not simply more irrigated land. More control over the agricultural calendar. More choices about what to grow and when to grow it. That is why Samendéni may become one of the most important tests of Traore's agricultural strategy. Not because 21,000 hectares sounds impressive, but because Burkina Faso has to prove it can build the system required to make that number productive. And if it can, the next question becomes even bigger. How many harvests can 1 year hold? What if the real agricultural revolution is not more land, but more time? That is the promise behind Burkina Faso's push for controlled water. At Segure, the government says the 180-hectare perimeter is designed to support up to 3 agricultural campaigns per year. In Laraba, the government has stated the same broader objective, continuous production through water control, allowing producers to farm up to 3 times a year. Think about the difference from a farmer's point of view. The rainy season arrives. Rice goes into the field. The rains disappear. But the land does not have to become useless. If water remains available, another crop can follow. Then another production window can open. The farmer has not gained another hectare. He has gained another season. And that changes more than output. It can mean more months of work, more opportunities to earn income, more demand for transport, more use of storage, more activity for processors, and a more regular flow of food into local markets. But this is still an ambition that has to survive reality. 3 production cycles also mean repeated costs. More seed, more fertilizer, more pumping, more machinery hours, more labor, more maintenance, more pressure on storage and markets. If the second crop arrives, but no buyer exists, the extra season can become a problem. If water costs are too high, the additional harvest may not be profitable. If pumps fail, the calendar collapses back toward the old system. So 3 harvests a year should not be judged by planting cycles alone. It should be judged by whether each additional cycle creates real value. That is the deeper transformation Traore's agricultural strategy is attempting. Not simply more tons, more productive months. Because Burkina Faso cannot manufacture more rainfall. But it can build systems that make rainfall less decisive. And the question is what it costs to keep those systems alive. Irrigation looks powerful when water first reaches the field. But water has a price. Pumps need electricity or fuel. Canals need maintenance. Reservoirs collect sediment. Drainage systems clog. Spare parts fail. And every additional production cycle puts more pressure on the system that made it possible. This is why irrigation can transform agriculture and still become another form of vulnerability if the country cannot maintain it. A pump that works on Inauguration Day proves very little. The real test comes years later. Can technicians repair it? Can replacement parts be found? Can canals still move the same volume of water? Can farmers afford the operating costs? Can water be distributed fairly when demand rises? These are the questions that decide whether a second harvest becomes permanent or temporary. The government has also tasked national agencies with dredging 100 dams during 2026 as part of the broader effort to mobilize water and support continuous production. That tells us something important. Building new irrigation is only half the battle. Existing water infrastructure also has to be restored, cleared, reinforced, and kept useful. That is the hidden side of water sovereignty. Infrastructure is visible. Maintenance is not. But maintenance is what decides whether the infrastructure remains real. And this is where self-reliance becomes institutional. It is not enough to finance a project domestically. Burkina Faso also needs engineers, mechanics, spare parts, operating budgets, water managers, and the discipline to repair systems before failure becomes a crisis. That is much less dramatic than cutting a ribbon, but it matters more. Because if irrigation collapses every few years, the old master returns. Rainfall. The country once again waits for the sky. So the real agricultural revolution is not building canals. It is building the capacity to keep water moving. The richest agricultural systems in the world did not become productive because they learned how to control the weather. They became productive because they built systems that made weather less powerful. Look at the United States. In many dry farming regions, production does not depend on rainfall alone. Water can be stored, moved, pumped, measured, and delivered to fields. And once the harvest arrives, another system takes over. Storage, transport, processing, insurance, finance, machinery, markets. Europe has its own versions of the same logic. Different climates, different crops, different policies. But the principle is similar. Strong agriculture is rarely just about good soil. It is about reducing uncertainty. That is the mirror Burkina Faso should be looking at. Not because Burkina Faso needs to copy America or Europe, and not because Western agriculture has solved every problem. It has not, but a country becomes more resilient when a failed rainy period does not automatically become a failed food system. A dam creates stored water. A canal creates access. A pump creates timing. Storage protects the harvest. Processing creates more value. Reliable transport connects the farmer to the market. Each layer removes one piece of uncertainty. So the real comparison is not Burkina Faso versus the West. It is Burkina Faso today versus the level of agricultural capability it wants to build tomorrow. That is the deeper self-reliance question. Not whether Burkina Faso can stop buying everything from abroad, but whether it can build enough capability at home that external shocks become less dangerous. Water creates options. A farmer with only rainfall has one calendar. A farmer with reliable irrigation has choices. What to plant, when to plant, whether to produce again after the rains disappear, and countries with more choices are less vulnerable. But there is only one way to know whether this strategy is truly creating those choices. Stop looking at the projects. Start looking at the results. So how do we know whether this strategy is actually working? Not by counting ceremonies, not by counting announcements, and not even by counting hectares on a development plan. The real scoreboard begins after the infrastructure is built. First, how many hectares are actually receiving reliable water, not hectares promised. Hectares farmers can really plant. Second, how long does the water system stay operational? A pump that works after inauguration is not enough. The question is whether it is still working years later through planting seasons, repairs shortages, and budget pressure. Third, how many productive cycles are Americans actually completing? If an irrigated field still produces only once a year, then the agricultural calendar has not changed very much. But if one rainy season crop becomes 2 reliable harvests and eventually 3 profitable production windows, then something structural has happened. Then come the economic measures. Are yields rising? Are farmers earning more? Are post-harvest losses falling? Is storage keeping pace with production? Can local processors absorb more crops? Are food prices becoming less vulnerable to seasonal shortages? And for the self-reliance argument, is Burkina Faso becoming less exposed to imports, in the products it is trying to produce domestically. That is the difference between infrastructure and capability. A canal is infrastructure. A second successful harvest is capability. And even that is not enough if the farmer loses money producing it. The final test is whether the entire chain creates value that can sustain itself. This is where the 21,000 hectare vision will eventually have to prove itself. Not on a map, in water uptime, in harvests, in farmer incomes, in local markets, and in the number of productive months Burkina Faso can add to its agricultural year. Because if the country moves from waiting for one rainy season to reliably producing through 2 or 3 windows, then the calendar really has changed. And once the calendar changes, dependence begins to change with it. What could Burkina Faso look like if this system actually works at scale? Imagine the agricultural year 5 or 10 years from now. The rains arrive. Farmers plant. They harvest. But instead of watching the fields go quiet for months, the next cycle begins. Water is available, seed is ready, pumps are operating, storage is waiting. Processors know what is coming. Transporters have markets to serve. The question is no longer, when will the rain return? It becomes, what do we plant next? That is not a small change. A second harvest means another season of income. A third production window can mean more work for machinery operators, mechanics, drivers, traders, warehouse workers, processors, and technicians. More predictable production can make it easier for a local processor to invest because raw material is available for more of the year. And once processing expands, Burkina Faso can keep more transformation employment and income inside the country. This is where irrigation connects to a larger self-reliance strategy. Water supports production. Production can support processing. Processing can support jobs. Skills grow around those jobs. And every capability Burkina Faso can reliably perform at home gives the country another option when it negotiates with the outside world. That does not mean imports disappear. It does not mean Burkina Faso stops trading with France, the United States, China, Russia, or anyone else. That is not the point. The point is that partnership becomes stronger when dependence becomes weaker. A country that can produce more itself has more room to absorb shocks, negotiate, and reject terms that do not serve its interests. That is why the 21,000 hectare vision matters even before it is completed. It represents a test of whether Burkina Faso can convert infrastructure into capability and capability into choice. Because the real destination is not 21,000 hectares. It is a country with more options than it had before. 21,000 hectares may be the number that gets attention, but the real story is much smaller. One field, one pump, one canal, one farmer looking at the dry season and realizing the year does not have to end when the rain does. That is the change Burkina Faso is trying to build. Not freedom from weather, not freedom from trade, and certainly not freedom from every foreign partner. Something more practical, more choices, more productive months. More food produced at home. More capability that survives after the speeches and ceremonies are over. Whether the 21,000 hectare vision succeeds will depend on maintenance, financing farmers markets, storage, energy, and years of execution. That test is still ahead. But if Burkina Faso can turn one agricultural season into 2 and 2 into 3 reliable production windows, then something deeper begins to change. The country is no longer simply waiting for the future. It is building more control over it. Water creates options. Options reduce dependence. And options create sovereignty. Do you think controlling water could become Burkina Faso's strongest path toward food self-reliance? Tell me why in the comments. And subscribe as we keep following what actually happens next. Disclaimer, this video is fictional storytelling created for education, commentary, and entertainment. It is not a factual report or official information. Any similarities to real events are coincidental. Please enjoy it as creative content only.